For more insight, we welcome to studio international affairs analyst Dan Perry, former Europe and Middle East editor at the Associated Press and former chairman of the Foreign Press Association in Jerusalem. Dan, thank you so much for being here in studio. 137 hostages remain in captivity. It's more than 9 weeks now, and we hear from our colleague Pierre about the fighting that is underway at this hour inside the Gaza Strip. At the same time, there are reports, Saudi reports, of a secret meeting taking place inside Europe, not in Doha, inside Europe. What do you make of these reports so far?
It's not unexpected that Hamas would at some point go back to the table and try to buy more time to regroup, in Khan Yunis in particular, with the cards that it has to play, which is the hostages. And the Israeli government is under tremendous pressure to do everything it can to bring back the hostages, even if it means delaying parts of the war at some cost. I think even if it means ending the war, if it came to that. It's a very difficult thing to contend with, because the Israeli public does want Hamas to be removed from power in Gaza, and I would bet a lot that the Palestinian public, in Gaza at least, does as well. But on the other hand, they also want the hostages returned. And they also want Israel's standing in the world preserved. And these three goals may not be attainable at the same time, at least. So I think if it came to that, Israel would be forced politically to put preference on returning the hostages, or at least as many of them as possible. And the really meaningful thing that we're hearing in these reports has to do with Barghouti. This, it must be admitted, is a clever move by Hamas, because Israel would hope for Hamas to be crushed militarily in Gaza and then politically among the Palestinians for having brought about this cataclysm. But if they succeed in bringing about the release of Barghouti, who all polls show would win the Palestinian presidency election and is from the Fatah, it'll be very difficult for a future Fatah government to wash their hands of Hamas.
And then we bring in the Houthis, who are targeting vessels en route to Israeli ports. Who gets to respond to this?
I mean, the Americans have a responsibility to keep the traffic going. It's in the world's interest to have the Suez Canal be a viable route of navigation. It's an incredible outrage. Now, indeed, you know, Yemeni waters, territorial waters, control part of the Bab el-Mandeb. That's true, not all of it. But they have a responsibility not to behave this way, and this is outrageously brazen. But the thing is this, realistically, for Hezbollah to send drones over Israel and to cause the displacement of hundreds of thousands in the north is an outrage. For the Houthis to thumb their nose at the world this way and to really threaten Israel economically if its ports in Ashdod and in Eilat become unviable is an outrage. For Qatar to play a double game is an outrage. For the Arab League to continue prevaricating about Hamas is an outrage. Israel can't just be bombing everyone.
I'm not sharing the outrage.
The world needs to step in. I think eventually pressure will be brought to bear. And perhaps at the end of the day, it comes down to Qatar.
And when we get back to Qatar, we can't not get back to what we were talking about at the start of this broadcast, and that is the fate of the hostages and what Qatar specifically is able to do. Two things: one, to broker this deal, and two, Dan, to put pressure on the Red Cross to get to those hostages so the families sitting here right now after more than 9 weeks can find out A, proof of life, and B, if their medicines can get to these people right now. Your thoughts on where that pressure is and why the outrage isn't resounding in our ears as we speak?
I don't know of a case in history, at least in the developed world, that we know about, where media operates, where infants and babies have been taken hostage, and this somehow is accepted, not accepted, but allowed to pass without too much agitation on the parts of global bodies like the ICRC. I understand it's difficult. Hamas is an Islamist terrorist group that doesn't appreciate the Red Cross, and they're not part of the Red Cross, the conventions that govern Red Cross. But Qatar could be made to put pressure on them, of course. They don't have to just succumb to the objective problems on the ground. They know how to deal with difficult situations, from the Taliban to the Boko Haram. And when they want to, they have a spokesmanship office. I know it very well. They know how to raise a big noise, and they obviously should. And if they're not inspired to do so themselves, they should be given some inspiration by their donors.
You made mention earlier of Russia, Vladimir Putin weighing in on some level in recent days. Talk to us about the pressure he could be putting on Hamas right now as well, in terms of getting access for the Red Cross to the hostages if he wanted to.
Well, Putin's main interest is in gaining leverage over Ukraine and of reintroducing himself as a player in the region, because it's not really that great for Russia to be seen as purely an ally of Iran, which is where it's gotten to because of the war in Ukraine. So he has a lot of interest. Of course, there were some hostages as well that he succeeded in getting, and whose freeing he succeeded in compelling. But mainly for Putin, it is a game of regaining legitimacy in order to then apply that to the end game in Ukraine.
I want to turn back to that Saudi report of that apparent hostage deal in the works, and I need to reiterate this is just a report, but it says the deal is expected to include children, women and men, including 3 senior IDF officers. Also, in return, Israel would release around 300 Palestinian prisoners, in addition to 10 veteran prisoners and Marwan Barghouti, which we discussed a little bit earlier. Is the Israeli public ready to see those people being released? 300 Palestinian security prisoners. Is it something the Israeli public is ready to accept right now?
I think the Israeli public is mature enough to understand the least bad option, and this may be not even that bad an option, because many people, including from the security establishment, have argued for years that Barghouti, who is a strange character who in the 90s was a man of peace and in the 2000s allowed himself to become part of the Intifada and to be embroiled in some murders he was convicted of, is a complex figure who, in a twisted landscape of Palestinian politics, has gained legitimacy because of his Intifada bona fides, and may be part of a solution to reinvigorate the PA. So a deal releasing him may be really good for Israel, in addition to something that can help nudge the Palestinians to a more normal place, because it's possible that he would absorb some of the support of Palestinian contrarians that is currently going to Hamas, which is a worse option.
And an invigorated Palestinian Authority is something that the U.S. has been talking about for a while now. Very briefly, we know that U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin is expected to visit Israel next week. His likely message, briefly.
I think his message is for Israel to start planning for the day after and messaging that and working with its potential allies, which would be the U.S., the EU, and mainly the countries of the Arab League.
Much to unpack, much to watch, much to discuss in the coming days and weeks as well. Dan Perry, thank you as always. We always appreciate you being here in studio, appreciate your insights.